Well, happy Friday, everyone. Hope you're wearing your red shirt for Remember Everyone Deployed. We do that every Friday in honor of those who are in the military, first responders, and that are giving their lives and putting their lives at risk to serve us. So wear red on Friday. Remember Everyone Deployed. All right, today's shout out is also a mail call. Got a beautiful postcard here. You can see that. See if I can get that lined up just right. And that picture is the Bald Rock Group Lodge is the old hotel. It is now used as a group lodge and sleeps 34, complete with dining room, large kitchen, and fireplace. And that's at the Cheaha State Park in Alabama. And the card is from The Adventures of Frank and Tina. It says, "Hello, Ian. Just a little note from Adventures of Frank and Tina from Cheaha Mountain." I can't read. I think it says Delta, Alabama. Highest point in Alabama, USA. Thanks for the friendship. Adventures of Frank and Tina. So there we go. Very, very nice. Well, thank you, Frank and Tina. If you don't know Frank and Tina's channel, you should check them out. Fun couple. Also, Tina has her channel as well. It's called Colette Fry. So it's Tina. I'm not sure if it's Tina Colette or Colette Tina, but check out both those channels. Adventures of Frank and Tina and Colette Fry. Alrighty, let's get to Chapter 2 of Land Rovers. Now, some people have voiced that they're not really into this story, and if the majority of you feel that way, then let me know in the comments and we'll quit reading it, because if nobody is interested in hearing it, there's no point in reading it, right? So just down in the comments say, read something different. Or I vote you read something different, and we'll see what kind of responses we get. All right, but for now, we're going to carry on. Chapter 2 is fairly long, so I'm going to read half this week. So it'll be Chapter 2A this week and Chapter 2B next week. Okay. Dust track to the Ellis. 2 faintly flattened marks across the desert were the only guidelines I could pick up with the light of the headlamps. If I increased speed, they became impossible to follow. Though Dave had done most of the driving that day, I felt as tired as if I had spent 10 hours behind the wheel. Twice the sheer monotony of keeping on the track caused me to doze off, only to be awakened by a sickening panic the moment later when the bump of the front tires hit on rougher ground that lay only a foot to either side of the track. To keep awake, I hummed my way silently through the music from Swan Lake, then Petrushka, and sat well forward, my eyes glued to the patch of light in front of the bonnet. Only 2 weeks ago I had been working in the office of a Melbourne firm that dealt in carpets, pictures, and china. Bored, on the spur of a moment, I marched into the office of the Division of National Mapping and asked for a job. "How old are you, son? 18? I nodded reluctantly. "You're too young," they said. "Anyway, there aren't any vacancies." Which made it all the more surprising when 5 days later came a telegram that whisked me out of Melbourne and planted me here in the middle of nowhere on the road to Kingunga. I slammed my foot on the brakes. In the second or two between seeing the outline of a building and bringing the Land Rover to a halt, I'd driven through the town and out the other side. The groaning of gears in reverse woke Dave. "Is this Kingunya?" I asked him. "It couldn't be anywhere else, Robin. The next town's miles and miles up the road." He jumped down and then looked at me with a wry grin. "You'll feel better after food and a good night's sleep. See those lights? That's the hotel." We walked across to the crowd around the entrance. Dave went inside while I kept walking around in a circle, trying to get the stiffness out of my legs. In a few minutes he was back, shaking his head. No grub, no beds, they're full. We'll have to camp around the back, but they can give us breakfast in the morning. I looked at him. I was so tired, food did not seem to matter any longer. But all the same, when we had set up camp, we cooked 2 steaks with potatoes and tinned vegetables. Setting up camp gave me a shock. What Dave brought out of the Land Rover was a heap of blankets, camp stretchers, and our 2 sleeping bags. There's your swag, chum. Swag? Bedroll. Where's the tent? He laughed. We sleep in the open. That's a big thing with you Pompies, isn't it? You never stop expecting rain. The next morning we woke shortly after sunrise. We wanted a quick breakfast in order to be on our way bright and early. But I soon learned that things seldom work out as planned in the outback. At the hotel, breakfast was slow in coming, and afterwards to refill the tank of the Land Rover, we waited half an hour at a solitary petrol pump without seeing any sign of life. Finally, the owner of the hotel strolled across towards us. You ain't looking for Bill, is ya? Dave nodded. Huh, you won't see no petrol this side of 9 o'clock then. Likes his bed, he does. Scratching his unshaven chin, he added, Can't say how I blame him. When I get to be Bill's age, I reckon I'll do the same. After that, I was curious to see just how ancient Bill would turn out to be. I had another half hour to wait before finding out. It was my first sight of an outback old-timer. Bill was browned, lined, unshaven, but with keen eyes younger than his years, which must have been nearly 80. Petrol you're wantin'? He asked. Dave nodded. The man hand-cranked the pump slowly until our tank was full again. How's the road? Dave asked him. No better, no worse than usual. Bill spat on the ground. Shouldn't give you no trouble. Not like it used to be when I was driving the mails up to Darwin. From then on there was no stopping him. Not that I minded, for it was an interesting tale of the tremendous battle to take a horse-drawn coach back and forth across the desert. But I could see Dave looking impatiently at his watch. He'd heard it all before. The morning sun was so bright as we drove out of Kingunya that the desert looked even less real than it had done the night before. But after we had been driving for several hours, with the heat steadily increasing, the color of the sky began to gradually change. Dave, driving, had a faintly uneasy look. The change began at the horizon, the bright blue becoming swamped by an ominous grayish-orange hint. This spread upwards, edging towards the rim of the sun, then swallowing it up altogether. All that remained now was a circle of blue sky overhead, and eventually this disappeared as well. From the west, a wind started to blow. Dust and sand whirled all around us, until by the middle of the afternoon we were in a dense fog of sand. It was 2 hours since I'd taken over from Dave. My eyes were full of grit, and ahead the road was hardly visible. Once, trying to blink the dust from my eyes, I lost track of the road altogether, and only a violent jerk of the wheel saved us from sliding down what appeared to be a steep bank covered with boulders. For another mile I kept going, in low gear, with Dave plodding along in front. Then he turned and signaled me to halt. I've lost it, he shouted, and waved his arm. Somewhere away on the right. Shall I swing around? I asked. He climbed into the seat beside me, with sweat and dust caked on his face. Better stay where we are. This isn't the right country for straying off the road. You just keep driving the wrong way until you run out of petrol. That's what happens, he grunted. 10 years later, somebody finds you if the sand hasn't covered you up. He wiped his face with a rag. Sandstorms give you an appetite. I'd been about to say the same thing. We battled our way round to the back of the Land Rover, lowered our swags to the ground, and hunted in the tucker bag until we found the kinds of tin food that could be eaten without cooking. Back in the driving cab, we opened the tins of meat and ate them with cold baked beans and followed this with fruit salad. Then, in a sudden lull, we dashed from the Land Rover to our sleeping bags, curling ourselves on the ground in the lee of the wheels to protect our faces, the only parts of us that were exposed. After a few minutes, I had to risk suffocation by pulling the sheet across my face, partly to filter the air, but even more because the rain of sand beating against my cheeks made sleep impossible. I thought of the cool, clean beds of London and Melbourne and dozed fitfully, conscious all the time of the sandstorm roaring all around me and of the drifts building up beside my sleeping bag. At about 1 o'clock I woke up to find the wind had dropped and the air had cleared. I wriggled out of the sleeping bag and stood up, shaking sand out of my clothes and shouting triumphantly with sheer relief at no longer being stung by millions of sharp fragments blowing at hurricane speed into my face. But my rejoicing was simply and sharply cut off. A hand appeared from the other sleeping bag. Dave held up one hand into the still air. "Huh," he announced. "The blighter's coming back. Quick, get back in your bag." But he was too late. With a violence that knocked me flying, the dust storm hit us again. I tried to shake away the grit as I scrambled back into my sleeping bag, but it felt as if I had half the Australian desert in there with me. I heard muffled noises of disgust from Dave, but somehow, in spite of the sand inside my clothes, I managed to sleep until dawn. Dawn is an over-cheerful word for what actually happened, which was a faint lightening of the orange-brown sky. Dave and I sat up at the same moment and looked glumly at the huge drifts of sand piled up against the Land Rover. There was no sign of let-up. Everything we touched had a thick coating of sand, and even the cold baked beans which we had to make do for breakfast gathered enough sand to make them unpleasant, though we ate them within seconds of opening the lid. A fire was out of the question, nor could we use our transmitter to speak to the flying doctor radio because the wind was too strong for us to put up an aerial. I looked at Dave inquiringly. "We wait," he said, munching on a mouthful of beans. "You'll get used to that out here. Sweating it out through the sandstorms and floods is a regular thing." He peered out of the cab of the Land Rover. "It's easing up a bit. With any luck, we'll be on the move in an hour." In fact, it was nearly 2 hours before we ventured out to look at the road. All we knew was that it lay somewhere to the right of us, and that we could not have traveled very far before discovering we'd lost it. The sand coated everything, and the wind had whipped it into wavelets like the pattern left on beaches by the ebbing tide. "There it is," Dave yelled. We had walked only 100 yards from the Land Rover, but it was not surprising that we had been unable to see the road from the driving cab. All that was visible was a set of parallel tracks a little below the level of the rest of the ground. Dave scraped the sand with his toe, revealing the hard surface of the road. We cleared the sand from round the wheels of the Land Rover, and then jolted our way over to the road. For a mile or two we kept a moderate speed, but then we lost the road again and had to search for it once more on foot. Luckily, the wind now dropped completely, for we had to do the same thing a dozen times in the next 20 miles. The sky had cleared and the sun blazed down on us with terrific force. I was hungry and worse still, terribly thirsty. But Dave kept on the move, and I understood why when a cluster of buildings loomed up ahead. "Cobber Petty," he said. "It's an opal mining settlement." He parked in the center and jumped down. Sand cascaded off him, making a small mountain around his feet. He laughed. Every time he moved there was another torrent of sand, and I joined him, rubbing my hands clean on a rag, then mopping down my face and neck. Facing us were 2 stores. From the door of one of them came 2 aborigines, the first I'd ever seen. Small, thin, with mops of black curly hair over faces almost as dark. They halted near the Land Rover and looked at us without any trace of expression. Dave jerked his thumb. Aborigines own that store. A white man runs the other. Doesn't matter which you patronize, they both charge fancy prices. He led me into one of the stores and lined up a row of soft drink bottles. There we are. That lot'll lay the dust. Surely there aren't enough people around here to support 2 stores. I gulped the fizzy orangeade, and my stomach seemed to be soaking it up as quickly as a sponge. Food is just a sideline, and I suppose really the prices aren't too bad, considering the distance everything has to be brought. No, these shopkeepers are here to buy as well as to sell. The miners bring their opals and trade them across the counter. It's just like the days of the gold rush, but on a smaller scale. Dave led me over to a door and pointed to the white humps which surrounded the settlement. That's mostly quartz they've dug up from the mine shafts. There was no sign of any mine shafts, at least not my idea of what they should look like, with a huge steel or timber winch tower above them, and I said so. It's not like that in opal mining industry, Robin. Every man's his own boss. These are one-man mines. Just a hole in the ground and a pulley at the top. The miner climbs down a ladder, fills his bucket, hauls on his rope until he's got it to the surface. Then he pulls another rope to tilt it and dip out the quartz. When he's brought up enough, he comes up and hunts through the quartz for opals. 3 miners walked past us in the entrance to the store. They're a tough-looking lot, I said. They were, in fact, the hardest-looking men I'd ever seen. Suddenly, the old pictures of the Australian gold rush, ones I'd seen in books at home, came to life. The riots, the murders, the bitter envy of the few who came rich by the many who lost everything. All this was understandable now I was standing in the center of Cobber Petty. It's a tough little town, Dave agreed, but it's quiet. That's because it's a dry town. Dry? No beer. He looked solemn, and that isn't easy for an Australian. A final gulp of orangeade, and he added, Come on, let's get on our way. We want to make Alice Springs by tomorrow. We camped about 100 miles further down the track. Then in the morning began climbing the McDonnell Ranges, which lay only a short distance to the south of the town. At last, when we were actually looking down into Alice Springs, Dave stopped the Land Rover and got out. What's up? Have a look for yourself. No hotel in the Alice will take us looking like this. I stared at him and then at myself. I had grown so accustomed to being dusty that it was difficult to remember that we had once looked quite different. We were both coated thick with dust that clung tightly to our bodies and hair. I was wearing a pair of orange shorts and nothing else. My shirt was not only torn, but so filthy we were using it for wiping the windows of the Land Rover. There was nothing much we could do about the dirt except wash our faces and comb the sand out of our hair. We covered up the rest of it by putting on clean trousers, shirts, and shoes. Then we drove down into town and pulled up outside the hotel Dave had picked. Just in time for a bath before dinner, he announced. A bath? What's that? Long tin thing, remember? Full of hot water? Huh, I climbed out. By the time I've finished, it'll be full of sand. I suppose it varies from person to person, but I find it takes me several hours to readjust myself to changes of situation. Sitting cool, clean, and well-fed in the lounge of the hotel, half of me was still in the desert. Though the sand was gone, I could still feel it, and hear it moaning and whirling past me. The ghost of a thirst remained. Well, that's Chapter 2, Part A. We'll read Chapter 2, Part B next week. Hope you've enjoyed that. And now the moment you've all been waiting for. The groaner of the week. Well, back when I was in about 7th or 8th grade, I can't remember exactly when it was, we were studying math, and the teacher said to me, Ian, if you lent Ralph $10, and he promised to pay it back $1 a week, how much money would you have after 7 weeks? And I said, nothing. And the teacher says, no, you're not paying attention. Listen to the question. If Ralph borrowed $10 from you and promised to pay it back $1 a week, how much would you have after 7 weeks? And I said, nothing. And he said, Ian, don't you know your math? And I said, yes, but you don't know my cousin Ralph. Anyway, that was a bad one. But yeah, if you know Ralph, he's not real quick about paying back. So don't loan him any money, no matter what he tells you. Sweet guy that he is. He's yeah. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. Don't forget to make a comment in the comment section and let me know if we should continue or if you want me to give it up and read something else. I know this isn't quite the action-packed adventure that Robin Hood was, but I thought it was kind of interesting when I read it. Anyway, until Tuesday, you take care, stay safe, have a great weekend, and God bless.